Great Scott! We're not just going to talk about one Back to the Future movie, we're going to talk about all three! Howdy, I'm Jeff Goldsmith. I'm the publisher of Backstory and the host of the Q&A. My agenda is simple. Each week I plan to bring you in-depth insights into the creative process of storytelling. And you know, today, kids, I am really excited to have with me screenwriter Bob Gale. He is the co-creator of the Back to the Future series, and that's right, we're going to talk about Back to the Future 1, 2, and 3 with Bob. And I gotta say, it was kind of like a dream interview come true. So this year marks the 35th anniversary of the original Back to the Future movie being released, and a new box set has come out. It's 4K, it's Blu-ray, it's packed with tons of bonus features, and we're celebrating Back to the Future and this box set release by interviewing Bob, and he was very generous with his time. We talked about a lot of amazing aspects of all three movies, and I'm such a fan. It was like a dream come true to be able to talk to Bob about this, so I know you'll dig this episode. And speaking of things to dig, you could also check out my magazine, Backstory Magazine, over at backstory.net, because I know you'll dig it as well. And if you've never read us before, you could test drive us by reading the free issue over at backstory.net. And you could read us on a desktop and laptop or via our iPad app, which is my favorite way to read us because it just looks beautiful on an iPad. But you don't need an iPad to read us. And if you like what you see in the free issue, I hope you'll consider subscribing. In fact, I'm going to make it even more appealing by telling you a secret discount coupon code, SAVE5. That's the word save and the number 5. That will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription to Backstory Magazine. And it gives you access to whatever new issues we produce in a year. And it also gives you access to our archive, which currently goes from about issue 41 to issue 30. And we're adding new older issues all the time, But yeah, we're adding older issues all the time to our archive, and we're going to keep going back down to issue number 1. So there's plenty for you to read. And in a few weeks, we are publishing our long-delayed pandemic issue. So that will be issue 42, and there's a lot of amazing stuff in there. So there's a lot of reasons for you to read Backstory Magazine. We could definitely use your support, so I appreciate you considering it. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right into our interview with screenwriter Bob Gale about writing Back to the Future 1, 2, and 3. So Bob Gale, welcome. It's great to see you. How's it going?
I've got the same complaints that everybody else in the world has right now, but otherwise, I'm fine.
That's great. You know, I went to USC, and you and Robert Zemeckis were always legends that were talked about and revered at USC, and we've studied your work there. What was the most illuminating thing that you remember for you as a writer in film school? Just kind of starting at the beginning. What was like a moment you could remember where the light bulb clicked off?
Well, listen, I was already focused on wanting to be a screenwriter when I went there. But the greatest thing about film school was to be in an environment where you were with people who were every bit as passionate about movies as you were. And remember, this is the early 1970s. There's no such thing as home video yet. And at USC over the weekends, they would run 8 movies in the screening room, 4 on Saturday, 4 on Sunday. And they would always be themes, directors' movies, composers' movies, cinematographers' movies. And this was such a fabulous way for me, for everybody, to be exposed to movies that you would never have been able to see otherwise. I mean, watching on TV, it's just not the same. So, they would get these 35 millimeter prints of these great classic movies, and they would run them. And then sometimes they would get, somebody who worked on the movies to talk about them. And there was also a class. Great. There was a class there that was known as Thursday Night at the Movies, and the film critic Arthur Knight, who knew everybody in Hollywood, he would arrange to have a brand new studio movie brought down to USC right, within days of its release.
Yeah, by the time I was there, it was called Cinema 466. And
it was always called that, but everybody referred to it as Thursday Night at the Movies.
It taught me a lot about film journalism, actually, because I was there during Charles Champlain when he was there moderating. So it taught me a lot about film journalism. But that's great advice, to watch movies and to keep familiarizing yourself with storytelling. There's a ton to cover on Back to the Future, so I only have two other questions before we get there,
Okay.
because we're going to be talking about all three movies. It's obviously the franchise you're known best for, but people also know you for Used Cars and for 1941. But I want to talk for a second about I Want to Hold Your Hand, which was your feature debut. What would you say was the most important lesson from that experience that helped you moving forward?
Well, I guess I would say that was there were two important lessons. One of them was that people made some of the same stupid mistakes professionally that they would make in making student films. I would say, well, people are just getting paid to make the same mistakes that we made in school here. That was kind of a surprise. And then the other thing had to do with the release of the picture, which we thought was not handled well, and the movie didn't do well at the box office. And it was the realization that the people at the top don't necessarily know what they're doing. The variation of, I guess it's the Peter principle, that you reach the height of your own incompetence is what they say. And
Nothing has changed.
no, and that was actually a big disappointment, because we thought, here we are, okay, my God, we've made this wonderful movie that tested great with audience, and for those of you watching this, just came out about a year ago on a fabulous new Criterion edition. So Blu-ray, it's terrific. So it scored great. Universal had high hopes for it, but the people in the distribution department, they never even saw the movie, because back then what they were doing was, it was called blind blocking and blind bidding, where a studio would say, okay, the big movie that Universal had on the horizon, and this was spring 1978. The summer big movie was going to be Jaws 2. And so they would say to the theater owners, you want Jaws 2? Then you got to take these three other movies. And they would say, well, okay, we want Jaws 2 so bad that we'll take these other movies sight unseen. That became illegal later, but that was the system that we were under. So the advertising campaign was not handled well on I Want to Hold Your Hand, and Universal didn't really care that much about it, because I remember the first advertising budget came in for it, and it was what was like about $2 million, and that was what the movie cost to make. And they said, well, we can't spend as much to promote this movie as the movie cost. But the advertising budget for Jaws 2 was $7 million, and that was okay because they spent $28 million on it. So the relative expenditure, if they'd have spent the $2 million to promote I Want to Hold Your Hand, they might have made a profit. And I don't know whether Jaws 2 made a profit or not. But so those were and of course then the other lesson was, hey, we actually know how to make a movie, and based on those test screenings, they're laughing at our jokes. The audience with the picture. As filmmakers, we actually know what we're doing here. That was really cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've always been a fan of your film 1941. Just tell me your most surrealist moment in that film. I'm happy to have you back to talk about the film in depth and Used Cars. But what was the moment that sticks with you as kind of the most surreal part of that experience?
The most surreal probably was to be on the set with Toshiro Mifune, Slim Pickens, and Christopher Lee. Three guys that you would never, in your wildest imagination, think could be doing a scene together. And they were there, and they were doing this ridiculously wonderful, crazy scene, where Slim Pickens, swallowed the compass out of the Cracker Jack box, and they're interrogating him. That was pretty surreal. Yeah.
That is one of my favorite scenes, by the way. Like that scene is just insane. So before we get into the spoilers, and it's hard to call them spoilers so many years later, but for anybody that hasn't seen the movies, we will give a spoiler alert. I just want to talk about your creative habit for a second. Maybe what it was when you were writing Back to the Future, and how it's changed if it has. How important is outlining to your process when you and Robert Zemeckis were collaborating on this, and you doing the screenplays thereafter?
Oh, it was critical. We used the index card method, which is we would lay out the structure, the whole picture on index cards up on the wall in our office. And sometimes that doesn't mean that you'd start from the beginning and go to the end. Didn't necessarily work that way, and uh, I don't even suggest that as a good way to work, because sometimes it is, sometimes not. But with Back to the Future, we would have these ideas. We'd say, okay, we got to have Marty invent rock and roll. So we would write on a card, Marty invents rock and roll, and then we realized, okay, if Marty's going to invent rock and roll, there has to be a scene earlier on that shows that he can play rock and roll. So that necessitated another scene, set up that Marty can play rock and roll. We want to have this kid invent the skateboard. So we wrote a card that said skateboard chase. And then we also had to say, okay, there's got to be a setup for the fact that he can ride a skateboard. So then we'd say, okay, there's obviously got to be a scene where he travels through time to get to the 50s, and then when he comes back. So those were cards. So pretty soon we started having this array of cards on the wall. And then you'd say, okay, he's got to run into his dad, he's got to run into his mom. And having these different scenes, you just sort of developed an instinct where in the structure these scenes ought to go. And again, the nice thing about having these cards with push pins on a bulletin board is that you say, nah, you know what? We need to move that scene later. And so you just take the card, you move it over 3 cards down or 2 columns over, and then you can see what that looks like. And then once we would have that all figured out, so we thought, then we'd go back to the beginning and say, okay, now let's kind of flush out each scene and see what we get.
Did you ever have a certain amount of cards that you were using? Like some writers designate a certain amount of numbered cards per act, or was it just what you felt like?
It was just what we felt like, just what we felt like we needed. Because writing is rewriting. A lot of times you'll say, oh, we need this scene. And then you'll read it and you say, no, we don't really need that scene. So that goes away. Or you'd say, this doesn't make sense. We need a new scene here. And then you'd write that.
How long was your carding process, your outlining process for Back to the Future, would you say?
God, I can't really remember.
Okay.
This was,
A
we
few years
started
ago.
yeah, 1980. That's when we
Well,
started writing the first draft.
so then how many years would you say that it took to get the draft that you wanted when you were shopping it around town? Like, did you complete your first draft within a few months of outlining?
Yes. The first draft we started in September 1980. The first draft was dated, I think, early February, maybe late February, 1981. So we knocked that script out in about 5 months, I guess. And then Columbia asked us, it was for Columbia Pictures, they asked us for some revisions. So we took about 6 weeks to do a second draft that was dated April 1981. And it was a second draft that was ultimately rejected by Columbia. And that was the one that we took around all over town and was rejected until finally Zemeckis was so depressed that he said, I'm going to direct the next decent movie that comes along. And the script for Romancing the Stone fell into his lap. And he said, I'm going to direct this. He turned it into a big hit. And then everybody and their uncle wanted to make Back to the Future, or they wanted to make Bob Zemeckis' next picture, which Bob wanted it to be Back to the Future.
What do you think is the reason why it was rejected? Did you get any hilarious notes that
Oh
people
God,
just
yes.
weren't getting it?
Oh yeah. The well, one major note was time travel movies don't make any money, which at the time was true, and we couldn't dispute that. So that was okay. This is a genre that hasn't really worked that well. So we understood that. Then we would get this note that the movie's very sweet. It's very nice. It's very family friendly, and we're looking for something raunchier. We want Porky's. We want Stripes. We want something along those lines. And why don't you guys take this to Disney? Why don't you guys take this to Disney? And we heard, why don't you take this to Disney enough times where Bob and I said, well, what the heck? What have we got to lose? Let's submit it to Disney. Let's take it to Disney. And this, remember, is Disney pre-Michael Eisner. This is the same studio that gave us classics like The Black Hole. So it wasn't really the first choice of filmmakers to go make a picture at Disney.
It's just funny because as a time travel movie, there was Time After Time in the late 70s, which also has your co-star of Back to the Future 3 in it, of course, and that actually did okay, truth be told. But there's always an excuse, I guess. So
exactly. Whether they meant it or not, they needed a reason to say no.
Right.
And that was one. But the so we go into this meeting at Disney, and the executive we walk into his office, and he looks at us with he's appalled. He said, how is it that you guys think that Disney would make a movie like this? This is a movie about incest. You've got the kid and his mother in the car, and we don't do that here. This is Disney. We do clean movies. This is incest. So for everybody else that thought the movie was too clean and not raunchy enough, Disney thought it was way too raunchy. And yeah, that's a story seared in my memory.
No surprise, I guess. When you sit down to write, do you give yourself a page count to hit each day, or do you go for a specific amount of time?
No, we work out. We write until we just say, okay, that's a good day's work, or let's type that up and see if it makes any sense. And the way we would talk the scenes out. I would make notes in longhand. I'd go home and type them up. Back then, we were using carbon paper in the early '80s, and I'd give Bob the scene that we worked out the day before, and then while I was writing the next new scene, he was going over the scene from the previous day and marking it up with a red pencil. And so finally, when we had an entire first draft, then I would go through and read the whole thing from beginning to end, and then we'd both go over it with Bob's red pencil notes and my new red pencil notes, and then the rewriting would start. And by the time we had a quote unquote first draft for the studio, it really was our own third draft.
That makes sense. And that's a good way to kind of keep revising on your own so that the studio sees the most polished draft.
Yes. And I can't stress how helpful it was to be working with somebody and have a collaborator who was trying to make the same movie that I was. We were both in it together. And the idea of being able to bounce things off of one another and say, well, that doesn't make sense. Well, why does it make sense? And know that you trusted one another to know that, Bob could say to me, well, that's a stupid idea. And I, wasn't going to take offense at that. He wasn't saying that I was stupid. He said it was a stupid idea. So, okay, I've got plenty of those, still do. And I'd say, well, what isn't working here? And he would explain it. Say, okay, I get that. Then we'd work it out some more, and pretty soon we'd have something that we both thought made sense.
That makes sense. Last question before we get into the spoilers really deep. What was something you do for writer's block if you get it? How do you battle it if you get writer's block?
Well, there's two answers to that question. One of them is that when you're working with a partner and you're both in the room, what invariably would happen is that we would spend the first 90 minutes or so just bullshitting, just, talking about anything other than what we were trying to write. And finally, we'd run out of stuff to bullshit about and say, well, we look at each other and say, we better get down to it. We're here for a reason. Let's go to work. And so having somebody there and thinking to yourself, I don't want to waste Bob's time, and Bob is thinking, I don't waste Bob's time. and that was a good discipline to say, okay, because writers can be really great at coming up with the reasons not to write. Oh, the mail's going to be here in another half hour. I might have something. Oh, today my email. I just heard an instant message. What is that? You can come up with a million
Right.
reasons not to write. And I find when I have writer's block, when I'm working by myself, the way to get out of it is to actually just sit down and write. And even if it's going to be wrong, to have to get the juices flowing, where you actually have to write a scene and say, okay, this is oh, now I know why I had writer's block. A lot of times, writing the characters doing something or talking about something helps you through why you couldn't get from point A to point B, because you were taking a side trip to point C, and you didn't need to go to point C, or maybe you need to go to point D instead of point C.
Yeah, and that's great advice. And in the computer era, there's some writers that actually install apps to turn off their ability to go to certain websites, or even turn off their Wi-Fi in its entirety when they're going to do a sprint of writing for a specific amount of time. So those are things
That's a
that some people have done as well.
good
But okay,
idea.
podcast listeners, YouTube viewers, we are getting into the spoilers of Backstory. We are getting into the spoilers of Back to the Future 1, 2, and 3. So if you have not seen those movies, we're going to go in order. Don't worry. This is where you want to press pause and go check them out. There's, of course, a brand new, beautiful box set coming out on Blu-ray and 4K, and that's what you should order to get into this and to see all the amazing behind-the-scenes stuff as well. All right, getting right into it. Starting easily. Ray Bradbury's 1952 short story, A Sound of Thunder, has been really important for time travel narratives on the screen, on the page, everywhere. I'm curious how important that was as an influence to you, because it essentially shows that a mistake of a time traveler in the past has a ripple effect forward. And it was really Ray Bradbury that did that, I don't know, the cleanest and in its most popular form, that led to a lot of innovation from a lot of other filmmakers. And I'm just curious, did it influence you?
Absolutely. Ray Bradbury, was one of my literary heroes. When I discovered Ray Bradbury through watching The Twilight Zone when I was a kid, and found out, there were a couple of the episodes that were based on his stuff, and somehow I found out, oh boy, there's this guy named Ray Bradbury, and he wrote all these cool stories, and some of them are very much like The Twilight Zone, and I just devoured Ray Bradbury. So yeah, Sound of Thunder, absolutely, that was
That's
something that stuck in my head.
Well, and that's something that also led into this movie, in which you figured out a way to use a token, a prop to show the progress, basically, that Marty is making in this movie. But also you did it again in all the other movies as well, in which here it's the picture of his brother and his sister,
Right.
and they're disappearing at points, showing that his timeline is being thrown off. And then as they're coming back together, it shows that he's reconnecting their timeline. So at what point did the idea of really taking a complicated concept and simplifying it into a visual object come about? Because it's brilliant in its simplicity.
It's really a variation on, the classic movie idea of the ticking clock. It's high noon, right? You know that something is going to happen, that those guys are going to get off the train at high noon. And so every time they cut to the clock in high noon, and you see how much longer does he have? Um, and there's variations of that in tons of movies. And so we realized that we needed to have some form of that. And it wasn't going to really make sense, as much sense. Doc Brown, we could have had Doc Brown say, according to my calculations, at exactly 9:35 on Saturday night, you'll be erased from existence. That it doesn't have the same power as seeing what the stakes are. And I don't remember exactly how it was that we figured that image out, that would be the way to go. But yeah, it had to be something really visual.
I mean, it's now screenwriting 101 of if you could show it rather than saying it, especially for a complicated concept, it's the way to go. So, kudos to you on that. Obviously, in Back to the Future 2, it became the newspapers, and Biff's matchbook, and then there was a different photo of the tombstone used in Back to the Future 3.
Right.
So it was something that just kept working out for you. The other biggest time travel movie that came out before then was Cameron's Terminator. I was curious if when you saw that before you had made Back to the Future, there was anything in there that sparked an idea of like, ooh, you know what? He went that way, but I could see myself going a different fashion.
No, actually, love Terminator, but it did not. Um, it did not affect the writing of Back to the Future because remember, Terminator came out in when was it? 1984, 83, 84, and we'd already written two drafts of Back to the Future
Right.
prior to that. So we already knew what we were trying to do with Back to the Future. So no.
Okay. Just had to ask. And you're right. It was 84. And I guess the other thing is that I'm really curious about for the first movie is when you figured out the arc of Marty's family, they start basically as mediocre with his dad having really never changed beyond being, the class nerd who has no confidence, with Biff kind of overlording them. And then in the past, obviously, although he restores the linear family aspect with the photo of being born and his parents, getting together, he also is giving his dad pep talks throughout the movie that help his dad with confidence so that when they return to the future, it's this great reveal when he wakes up and the inside of his house is different. His dad is well off. His dad went after a career becoming a sci-fi writer. His brother and sister all have better lives as well. At what point did you realize that that was a possible ending? Because I could see the whole movie without that ending. That ending was just icing on the cake.
That ending was pretty early on. The I think in the first draft, which I have not read in quite some time, but the concept that um, Marty's going to interact with his with his young parents, and the cliche, was father knows best. The TV series,
Right.
your parents are smarter than you, and we thought, wouldn't it be fun to turn that trope on its head? Instead of having the parent straighten out the kid, have the kid straighten out the parent. So that was one of the very, very first ideas that we came up with, because we said, how's Marty going to interact with his what kind of people are his parents? And so that conceit was just too wonderful to not do, and so we had to pay that off. So in the early first draft, believe it or not, George McFly grew up and he became a prize fighter.
Really?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He was, some lightweight or welterweight champion. And Marty comes home and he sees all these prize fighting awards. And when we were finally making the movie in pre-production, Bob and I started thinking, well, maybe that's not really the kind of career that we ought to be encouraging people to have, and that just kind of is a harder pill to swallow, that George would have actually enjoyed fighting so much that he would have turned that into his career.
It could give you a crossover to the Rocky franchise as well. I'm sure you might have thought. But yes, arriving at the pin is mightier than the sword was a perfect ending for him as well. One of the things that's always tough for screenwriters, especially in science fiction, is exposition. And it's even had a joke of certain characters being called Dr. Exposition. They show up in a movie, they explain the science behind something complicated in layman's terms, and then generally they leave. Sometimes they're the main characters, but often they're side characters. Here, the invention of Doc Brown is brilliant because you're doing the best trick a writer can, which is to mask exposition. So here, Doc Brown is funny. He's off center, so he sometimes has ideas that are incorrect or goofy, and he's also extremely cartoonish. And I know part of that is the brilliant delivery that Lloyd had. But I'm curious what your challenges were on the page to get the right tone for Doc Brown, because in each movie he really is pitch perfect. But it also could have been a character that could have slowed down the movie, could have sagged it. It could have been the part of the movie that people hate, but it's really the part of the movie people love. So what were the challenges of creating Doc Brown?
Well, let me rewind just a little bit, because you're talking about exposition, and the some of the exposition that we're really most proud of is the exposition that happens at the dinner table. The dinner table scene, where in order to understand this movie, we knew we have to tell the audience the entire fictional history of the fictional McFly family. And how are we going to do that? And so one of the rules of dialogue is you should never have characters tell each other things that they already know, right? So
Great rule. Great rule.
how are we going to how are we going to get this out? So we have Lorraine kind of being this lush. She is a lush. She's in this kind of drunken haze, reminiscing. And what we do to take the curse off of it is Linda says, "Yeah, Mom, we know you've told us the story a million times." And she recites a lot of the exposition, and then Lorraine corrects her. So what we're seeing here, again, disguising the exposition, we're seeing a very dysfunctional family being presented here. And you're saying, as the audience, saying, "Oh boy, this is really one messed up. This is really one messed up family unit here." And we're getting the information, but it's also disguised by this device of how it's presented between the characters arguing about the past, and that it's not, you're not thinking that this is so important as what we're telling. Now then, of course, we get to Twin Pines Mall, and we use this great device of Doc Brown wanting to record the exposition about how his time machine works for posterity. This is the big one, Marty. I waited for this my whole life. Roll tape, and I'll explain this. So he's laying this down for posterity, but of course he's explaining this for the audience, and then turns out he's also explaining it for his younger self. And one of the joys as a screenwriter, when you have an actor who is as wonderful as Christopher Lloyd, is knowing that he can do this and rattle this exposition off at an incredible clip, and get it across and make it funny and entertaining. And he understood that, and of course Bob gave him that kind of direction, and it was sort of clear in the script. And then later, when it came time to write the sequels, to know who the performers were, who all the performers were, they're going to be saying this dialogue, to know that I could write anything for Christopher Lloyd, and he'd just be able to rattle it off, and just it was great. It was great.
And his performance was amazing. So I mean, like, would you say that the key to Doc Brown was keeping the exposition also entertaining?
Yes, keep the exposition entertaining. One of the dialogue rules of Doc Brown was Doc would always use a big word when a little word would do. So when he sees that poster for the dance,
yes,
he'd say a rhythmic ceremonial ritual, and it's just okay. It's just hilarious.
Yeah, it was great.
And then suddenly he'd switch and say, "When this baby hits 88 miles an hour, you're going to see some serious shit." And nobody expects Doc Brown to say the word shit.
Right.
And it's great. So we have this character who's he's not the archetype mad scientist. He's not the archetype, glasses on nerd geek scientist. He's got a gun with him,
Right.
Later on, he pays off the cop at Town Square, I mean, he's just this really complicated, wonderful character who just has to do his science.
Yeah, as studying the movie, the only piece of exposition that my eyebrows went up a little, and it almost made me wonder if it was like a reshoot with ADR, was when they're walking into the school. Doc, all we're seeing is their backs. We're not seeing their faces. And Doc is very clearly telling him one of the most important pieces of the movie, that if his parents don't get together, he's never going to be born. And it's almost like upping the stakes in that moment. And I'm curious if that was something added later for audience clarity, because it's so surprising to not see their faces during that moment.
Well, boy, you're on, Ashley. My hat, I'm not wearing a hat, but if I had one, I'd take it off.
Thank you.
There was actually a scene that we shot where Doc was helping Marty get dressed for school, and the exposition was said that where we see the characters saying it, and um, we kind of felt that there was something that the audience might find uncomfortable, having this older man helping this kid get dressed, and we cut the scene out for that reason. And we put the exposition in post. It was the same. It was the same dialogue, but yeah, we did it over their backs, because we knew we had to get that out there, and that's why it is that way.
Thanks for solving a question I've had since I was a young man. In all three of these movies, there's textbook setup and payoff. Just starting even with re-elect Mayor, Goldie Wilson, right? And then we meet him as a younger person in the diner, and then the thread about Uncle Joey being in prison, and we see Uncle Joey as a baby saying, "Get used to that." And Biff yells about doing, the work for him in the present of '85, and then the homework in 1955. Is that something that was always a part of your outline, or is that something that kind of jumps in by the time you're scripting, where you see that those connections could come about in something like this?
Well, there were certain things that we came up with later, like the Uncle Joey joke was added at some point, but the homework and the occupational work, that was always there. That was clearly an important benchmark, that we're going to see that history repeats itself. So that was very clear. And in terms of where did Bob and I learn that device, it was from watching so many classic Billy Wilder movies, classic Frank Capra movies. Hitchcock did it, Howard Hawks to some extent, but
Sure.
but certainly, Billy Wilder was an absolute master at that sort of thing, and so yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, you threaded it on overload throughout all these movies, and it's just beautiful, all the setup and payoffs that are in there, especially when we get to number 2 and 3, which you co-wrote together. I've always wondered, it's always a great idea to kill off a character in the quote unquote present especially of a time travel movie, and then get more time with them in the past. And this was done so beautifully here with Doc's early death, which is a huge surprise. You just don't see that happening. And then to meet him again as the young, vibrant Doc, and have the existential question of should he be told about his death in '85, and then the letter that he's given that he rips up. Tell us when that idea entered, because it's for as much of the love story of Marty's parents is important, that buddy relationship between Doc and Marty is really the glue that holds everything together. And it was just a tragic moment when you see him rip up the letter, and then a uproarious moment when you later see him. The whole audience was applauding when I saw it, when you see him sit up and have a bulletproof vest.
Yeah, this was part of the story from the very first draft. And it was not Libyans that shot Doc in the first draft. Doc had ripped off the plutonium himself, and it was special agents from the government that had tracked down the plutonium theft, and thought Doc Brown was trying to escape, and they shoot him. And Marty escapes in the time machine, which in that draft was a time chamber built out of an old refrigerator. So the concept
really. Wait, at what point did it become a car?
It became a car when we were pre-production finally. in
That
1984.
late, that late.
Oh
Wow.
yeah, oh yeah, 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 yeah. And in fact, there was a draft. In the third draft, it was still a refrigerator, and Doc had to carry it around on the back of a pickup truck. And what happened was one morning, uh, Bob came into the production office, uh, and he said to me, Bob, I'm thinking about how much work it's going to be to shoot Doc putting the time chamber on a forklift and loading it on a pickup truck and hauling it around. Wouldn't it be better if if the time machine was mobile, if Doc built the thing into a car? I said, well, yeah, that would save a lot of, they would save a lot of shooting time and aggravation. And then Bob had the most brilliant idea. What if it was a DeLorean? Uh, and what made him think of a DeLorean was that John DeLorean was on trial.
Right, right.
This was in the summer of 1984. So he was on the news all the time. And so the DeLorean was in everybody's consciousness. And, look, the gull wing doors, there was no car that ever resembled the DeLorean. It just
Yeah.
was so cool. And when he said DeLorean, it was like, oh God, yes. How do we not think of that? It was like, yeah, we got to do that.
The refrigerator draft. That's something I might want to read. That might be fun to publish some scenes of that in my magazine backstory.
Well, then, we know Spielberg read that draft because
Right.
the opening of
Crystal
Indiana
Skull.
Jones, yeah, exactly. At a nuclear
Yes.
test site, which was where the climax of Back to the Future took place, because they had to take the refrigerator to this nuclear test site and literally harness the electrical energy released. I mean, the atomic nuclear energy released by the bomb. And when our budget came in, and uh, the studio said, you guys need to cut $1 million out of this. We don't care how you do it, but if you can't cut $1 million out of the budget, you're not making the picture. And Bob and I sat down with the script and we said, well, the most expensive thing that we have in the script is this location shoot in the desert where we're going to build this uh, nuclear test facility with this little town. If we can figure out a way to not do that, that'll save us $1 million easy. And we spent a weekend walking around on the back lot, and at that time the courthouse did not have a clock pediment on it. And then we came up with this whole idea about lightning and the clock and all that, which turns out to be way better than what we had originally written. So having limits on your creativity sometimes makes you more creative and makes you come up with things that are even better than what you would have had if you had an unlimited budget.
Absolutely. There's a theory that sometimes writers, I think it's mostly subconscious, but you could see it in this and especially the other films as well. There's a theory that's been regarded as the mini movie theory of writing, which is what a lot of people call it, in which your protagonist has very specific goals that really within the course of a movie you could solve in about 20-25 minutes. And so if you add a B story to it to complicate things, to stray them from their path, you're doing like 2 mini movies at once that are threaded now over 40 minutes. And here, we essentially have the dilemma of Marty making sure his parents meet and also getting back to the future. And then, as we said, the course correction for his family is the icing on the cake. I'm curious how conscious of that you were as you're intertwining them, because each scene is kind of going back and forth, once they're back in the past at least, between Marty's goals of getting his family, reunited so that he's born, and also getting back to the future, quote unquote, and all the, rigmarole involved with that. So is that something that you're conscious of having these very distinct goals that are then
absolutely, absolutely. And what's different about Back to the Future than the way that many movies do their A and B stories is Back to the Future, the stories are nested because
yes.
Marty cannot go back to the typically you'd say you want to have the A story and the B story resolve within 5 minutes of each other or even at the same time. That's really great when that can happen. But in this case, we needed to have the B story, if you want to call it that. The George and Lorraine story has to resolve before we can resolve the A story. But we knew that was it's the Wizard of Oz, right? Um, you know, Dorothy. The movie isn't going to be over until Dorothy gets back to Kansas, but when she gets to Oz, she has she's not even going to be able to meet Oz, the Great Oz, until they get rid of the witch. So that too is a nested structure, and what helps an audience, I think, is to always know what has to happen for the movie to be over. Um,
Yes,
and
that's a great point.
and you see movies sometimes. A classic example that I talk about where that rule is violated is in the first of the Daniel Craig James Bond movies, Casino Royale. Um, they tell you that the movie's going to be over after the scene in the casino, the stuff plays out in the casino, but it isn't. Then it just keeps on going and going and going. And I remember watching that saying, when is this movie going to be over? Because I was expecting that the climax at the casino was going to be the big resolution. And then they go off and they have this big chase sequence in Venice and so forth. And it really kind of threw me for a loop. And I felt like they didn't set up what the stakes were. That I felt like that was what they told me, and then it wasn't. So yeah, you need to tell the audience this is when the movie's going to be over, so they're with it. So they
Yeah,
they pace themselves.
I love Casino Royale, and I'm a poker player, so that probably influences it as well. But you're totally right. The sinking of the building in Venice, everything after the casino, it could have been compressed to a lower amount of time, but they wanted a flashier way, I think, to dispose of the villain and
Probably,
get through
yeah,
that. But
yeah.
great point for sure. Um, you know, it's also interesting that some of your transitions in all three movies are just so pinpointed. And like exactly the next moment you're going to, and it's always through visual cues. Even within the frame, sometimes just you get so much done, kind of mise en scène, in which things are happening always behind people that they're unaware of. How much of it is on the page versus things that are discovered when you're shooting it that could connect those moments together?
Oh, we're always thinking visually. I mean, it's the key to being a good screenwriter is what is the picture that tells the story. And as you say, the idea of when you make a cut, for you to be able to understand in the space of that cut what happened in the day in between those cuts, what happened in a couple of hours, whatever it was,
Sure.
to have a picture that says, "Oh, they got that done." Um, we don't have to see Doc building the tabletop model. We understand that he's the kind of character that would do that, right? And so when you see that, you just say, "Oh, okay, cool, I get that. That's what he was doing all this time." Yeah, we're always thinking of that stuff.
Ooh, hey, I'm jumping in really quick to remind you to check out Backstory Magazine. That's right, it's my passion project, and we could definitely use your support during the pandemic. If you've never read us before, you could test drive us. That's right, there's a free issue waiting for you to read over at backstory.net. You can read us on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app. And I think you're gonna dig what you see in our free issue. So if you would consider subscribing, it would mean the world to us. You could use discount coupon code SAVE5. That's the word save and the number 5. That will save you $5 off a subscription over at backstory.net. And then your credentials could also be used to log into the iPad app. So you get both for the price of one if you happen to want to read us on an iPad. But you can only find that discount code over at backstory.net. So look, we have a new issue coming out soon, which is issue 42, our long delayed pandemic issue. So it'll be great to have your support for that. And we're going to keep making new issues during the pandemic. So now's a crazy time for the film industry, but we have a lot to offer you at backstory.net. So we hope you'll check it out. And it really means the world to us to have you support our passion project. But now, without any further ado, we're going to jump right back into our interview with Bob Gale about Back to the Future 1, 2, and 3, which have recently been released on a 35th anniversary Blu-ray 4K amazing box set that I hope you also check out if you're a fan, because aside from it looking and sounding beautiful, it's packed with bonus features as well. So now let's jump right back into our conversation with with Bob Gale. It's an interesting moment when Marty is locked in the back of the trunk of the car, because it allows his dad to really be his own hero as the plan completely unfolds and, is going the wrong way. It's not the way that Marty wanted it to go. At what point did you get that idea? Because it's really great, in which characters that are proactive are always more important than characters that are reactive. And that was just a great way to solve it.
Well, this is classic in the caper genre, right? You set up a caper, you set up the bank robbery, in Asphalt Jungle, in Rafifi, in The Getaway, in all these great bank heist movies, in The Dirty Dozen, which is sort of a heist movie in its own way. You set the plan up. Here's the plan, and then something goes wrong. And that's what keeps the audience on the edge of their seat. Oh my God, that didn't happen. Oh my God, Telly Savalas has gone crazy in The Dirty Dozen. He's going to blow the whole thing, right? The cop came too soon. That wasn't when his shift was supposed to be. All that kind of stuff. So that is always, you have to have, when you set up a plan like that, you always have to make it go south. You have to have a glitch in it, because that's what gets you excited.
I want, I still want to ask a few number 2 and 3 questions. So we're gonna finish up on Back to the Future 1 before our time runs out. But the clock tower sequence,
yes,
again, like you said, having a distinct point. Well, when the mission objective was reached of the parents coming back together, and Marty just sits up, like as he's playing guitar when he was fainting a moment ago, and it's so clear that section of the movie's over. You're kind of like, okay, so now he's just going to go back, and that's going to be the end of the movie. No, you have just this heart pounding, amazing sequence with the clock tower. I've always found it funny that Christopher Lloyd is, up on top of this clock tower, hanging off the clock, almost as a nod to Safety Last with Harold Lloyd. And
well, we've got in the very opening shot, you see that clock with Harold Lloyd hanging off of it.
Right.
We knew what we were doing. Yeah.
What were the challenges of writing that sequence? Because so much is going on. He's on the clock tower. He's coming down the wire and everything. And I'm just curious how it looks on the page to write like a heart beating action sequence like that, where everything's moving really fast and there's screamed dialogue at the same time, and they can't even hear each other. Is one of the other problems in that scene.
Yeah, the scream dialogue is great, isn't it? Yeah. And that the wind machine was so loud that they didn't have to work too hard they didn't have to act. They were screaming. We think about all that stuff. Everything ends up being storyboarded, and in the script, rather than putting a slug line everywhere, we would just call this clock tower sequence. And then each line would be in its own paragraph. Doc takes another step on the ledge. Marty hits the gas. The speedometer is at, 72. All these lines in there that when you're reading them feel like cuts. And then we turn this over to our storyboard artist, and he draws it based on the script. And then Bob would sit down with storyboard artist and go over this and say, I want a shot here of this. Let's not do this here. Let's move this down there. So it was very well thought out, both first in the writing and then visually in the execution. And this is true in every single action sequence in Back to the Future. Not every scene is storyboarded, but every action scene is absolutely storyboarded.
That's awesome. Well, the last part of the movie is obviously setting up the sequel. It's a good thing to do as a writer. You want to be hopeful that there's a sequel. Was that always the way it was going to end? That you knew in advance the next movie was somehow going to be about his kids?
No. As Bob Zemeckis puts it, if we knew there was going to be a sequel, we would have never had Jennifer get in the car.
Interesting.
We thought that this was it's a joke. Something's got to be done about your kids. First, something had to be done about his parents, then something has to be done about his kids. It's a joke, and it's funny. And if you don't, back in the day when there was no idea in anybody's head that there was going to be a sequel, audiences laugh. It's your kids. Something's got to be done about your kids. And then the idea that our heroes ride off in the proverbial sunset to have another adventure. That is a totally satisfying ending. You don't have to see the next adventure. You know that they're together and they're going to have more adventures and in the future, figuratively and literally. And then when it came time for us to write the future, to write part two, we said, oh my God, we've got two really serious issues here. One of them is, what are we going to do about Jennifer? But the bigger thing is, we've just made a movie where we've told the audience that the future can be changed, that the future doesn't necessarily have to be the way you think it is. So Marty could just turn to Jennifer and say, I know how to solve this problem with our kids. I'm not going to marry with you. We're breaking up. Now, we knew that wasn't going to be a very satisfying way to start Back to the Future Part 2. And we really did have to go to the future and show that his kids were messed up. But it was a huge creative challenge to us because we felt like, oh God, we got to show the future, and we've already said that the future can change. How do we get out of this? And what we did was we said the future section of the movie is just Act One. The whole movie cannot take place in the future. The future section is a way to kick off what the real story is, which is the story about this sports almanac and Biff completely perverting the space-time continuum.
Well, right, because what's so interesting getting into Back to the Future too is that your act structure is it starts in 2015, which is the quote unquote future. They solve the issue there for Marty's kids, again, a mini movie. Within about 30 pages, it seems they've solved that problem. And then they come back to 1985, but he's in the wrong house. The neighborhood is all gone really bad. His car's on fire, stuff like that. And they realize that they're in this bad time zone where his mom is married to Biff. And this is what Biff has done. So once they get through that, they then solve that. And now you're back in 1955 for your third act. And you're doing basically a Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead of Back to the Future, in which they're running behind the scenes. they're running behind the scenes, and they're filling in the blanks of the different things that we never saw. So I think the structuring of Back to the Future 2, although I was much younger when I first saw it confused the hell out of me, but I couldn't take my eyes off the screen because it was absolutely incredible how much you packed into each act. Like there was no wasted time. I would even say the fact that oh my God, it's slipping my mind. The actor that was going to play his dad, the deal fell through, Crispin Glover. And so even the notion of killing him off in your screenplay as a solution to not being able to have him in the movie added a dramatic weight that gave an urgency toward restoring the correct timeline. That was just, honestly fantastic. I having just rewatched Back to the Future 2 and I hadn't seen it in a while, I was very impressed at the way that everything was clicking together in a very complicated style. I guess on that note for a second, was there anything you want to tell us about what would have happened if Crispin Glover was in the movie and wasn't killed off? Some early plans that you had?
Well, we didn't have, before we wrote a single word about Back to the Future Part 2, Bob and I sat down and we said, okay, what is it that people want to see in a sequel? They want to see the characters that they love from the first movie. And we knew when Universal asked us to do a sequel, we said, okay, if we don't have Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd, we're not going to do a sequel because there's no Back to the Future 2 without those two guys. So Universal agreed and said, okay, we'll go off and make deals with those guys. And interestingly, Universal made deals for 2 movies at the time. So we'll not only are we going to lock them up for 1 sequel, we'll lock them up for 2 sequels. So they did that. We weren't even thinking about 2 movies. We were only thinking about 1. And we weren't even thinking about what it was going to be. So then once we had those guys, we said, all right, let's see who else we can get. Let's see who wants to come back and do another movie. And so we contacted Leah, and she said, if you guys are doing it, count me in. And we contacted Tom Wilson, and he said, if you guys are doing it, count me in. And we contacted Crispin's through his agent, and Crispin's demands were excessive, we thought, and the studio thought. And we said, well, if your client is serious about about that much money and so forth. Ask him to rethink it because we're not gonna do that. And 2 weeks later, the agent said no, that's what he wants. We said okay, then we'll just make the movie without him. And of course, the precedent the precedent for that being The Godfather Part Two, when they couldn't get the actor who played Clemenza to come back, and they replaced him with Michael B. Gazzo, playing a different character. But we said, okay, we've got Biff, we've got Lorraine, but we don't have George. What are we going to do? And we said, well, let's have George be dead. And so that was, as you
So
say,
there wasn't a draft with him doing anything else. That makes sense
no,
because you knew that before
no.
you were writing it.
No, and then later when we were in pre-production, and we heard back from Crispin, and he thought, well, maybe I ought to be in this movie after all. And we'd written old elderly George in 2015, and we came up with the idea of hanging this guy upside down because we knew there was a perception experiment that's really hard for you to identify a human face when it's upside down. We said, okay, if we have a guy and we make him up to look kind of like Crispin would look as an 80-year-old man, nobody will think twice about that. And Crispin thought maybe he'd come back and be in it. And again, we could not make a deal with him. So if he'd signed on then, yeah, we would have had him. We would have had him play old George, and we would have had him in the 1955 sequences.
Sure.
But we were married by them to the idea that Biff had him killed, or Biff killed him himself.
It was a great idea. It works perfectly. The interesting thing that grew out of Back to the Future 2 and 3 that linked them, that is missing from Back to the Future 1, is the concept of nobody calls me chicken. And so, whereas violence, I mean, it's a fist punch to the face, but it is violence. Violence was used to solve the problem in Back to the Future 1. And even as you just said, George was going to become a prize fighter. Like, he was so confident in his skills. It's interesting that the concept of de-escalation and walking away from a fight is what really guides these two movies and shows what gets, Marty in trouble as well. At what point did that idea come about when you were putting these two movies together? Because it's a big through line, and it wasn't really something that was a part of the first movie, but I'm not criticizing it. I welcome it, but it's just interesting because it was something very, very new for the guy that beats up the bully in the first movie to, they stray away from that here.
Remember, it was George.
Right. No, I know.
So, but in the first movie, the pivotal character is George McFly. He is the guy who's a different man at the end. Of course, Biff too. But George is the guy that makes the character change. Marty is really the same guy at the end of the movie as at the beginning. Doc is the same as he is at the end. As the beginning. So when it came time for us to think about the sequel, we said to ourselves, okay, somebody has to have some character growth here. And let's make it, it's got to be Marty. And what is it about Marty that we can deal with? Well, we do see in part one that Marty is a bit of a hothead, that whenever Biff is picking on Lorraine, he's, in the school cafeteria scene, Marty gets up and wants to throw a punch. And in the diner scene, when he trips George and is laughing or is pushing him around, Marty gets in there, and we thought, okay, Marty, we have established that Marty is a bit of a hothead, so let's just push that a little bit further. And people say, well, if you were able to go back in time and remake anything about Back to the Future first one, what would you do? Maybe we would have Biff call Marty chicken, and Marty say nobody calls me chicken, and set that up in the first movie, because it would have felt fine in either one of those two scenes, and so that was what we came up with to run with what Marty's character flaw was going to be, and why Marty would end up being so screwed up that he was unable to turn down the invitation to drag race because he was called a chicken, and let's run with that.
Sure, right. And he's called a chicken by Needles, played by Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Right.
Was there ever a plan to show the Rolls-Royce accident and Marty hurting his hand, or was it something that you really just wanted to talk about in that movie to show, Marty's bad future? Because
There
I
was
could
no
easily see you filming the sequence as well and showing like the progression.
there really was no way that we could show it other than doing a flashback,
Right.
and that really wasn't part of our MO in these movies. We didn't do any flashbacks in the first movie, and it would have come out of nowhere. So it was just better to have Lorraine babble this stuff, because we knew from the first movie that Lorraine is a character that can babble exposition, and it would work out fine.
It's just
So
fascinating that you do the solution to it in the third movie, because you are in a flashback in the third movie where you see him not race Needles back in the past that we know of 1985.
well,
And
no,
so
it's not a flashback. We're in real
no, it's in the
time.
present. No, I know.
Right.
But so it's in the present of 85, but you see
Right.
him, because you know the future story. It's
Yes,
just
exactly.
fascinating.
You
You
see
waited a whole
that
movie
we
to
right, right. But we also knew that um, the audience would already know from the end of part two that they were only going to have to wait 6 months for
right,
part three.
right.
It wasn't like I remember seeing Star Wars: The
Yeah.
Empire Strikes Back, and walking out of the theater, the screening, wherever I saw it. What kind of ending is this? Han Solo's in carbon freeze. That's the end of the movie.
I was blown away. It was so great.
It was so unsatisfying. Is there going to be another one? We don't know.
I,
You got to
I, I
wait. Wait
it's a
4
classic
years.
ending because it was one for me, one of the first times I saw like a cliffhanger like that in a major movie, not a TV show, which was amazing. But again, to Back to the Future 2, I saw it in a theater, and I actually didn't know that there was already a sequel that had been
Well, sure
shot
you
and was
did,
coming
because
out.
we had a trailer for part three.
That's what I'm saying. Like when the trailer happened, I'm like, I've never seen that in my entire life. A trailer ending a movie. I thought it was brilliant. It was
Well,
wild.
I would love to. I would love to. Take credit for being
Oh.
brilliant, but it was done in Richard Lester's The Three Musketeers. That's
Sure.
where we got. That's where we got the idea.
And it's a throwback to the serials also. That
Oh yeah. All the great old movie serials. But I remember seeing The Three Musketeers, which for anybody who has not seen
it's great.
those versions, the Three Musketeers, the Four Musketeers, the very best versions of those of that story ever made, and loving the Three Musketeers. And then, oh my God, there's another one next year. It's coming. Wow.
It was
I was
amazing.
so excited.
Yeah.
I sat up. Oh, it's so great.
We were talking about structure a second ago, and I think one of the most brilliant things of the structuring of Back to the Future 2 is that we really want to see some of those in between moments, right? And the movie is slowly getting filled with them, but we don't really see Biff's car ride back. And how he learned to use the time machine, go back, and then come back to 2015. And although I am curious if there was ever a plan to show any of that, like him learning to use the time machine on the fly, the structural brilliance of actually showing future Biff back in 1955, which was something that we kind of at that point had forgotten a little about, weren't sure what was going to happen. It was great. So had you ever had an earlier plan when Biff departs to have the story splinter, to show him really right after he departs going on his mission, or was it always going to be something you were going to save for your third act? Because it's brilliant.
It was always the way that you see it, because we didn't want to tell the audience how did 1985 get so screwed up. They may have figured it out, but we didn't want to show that scene until Marty saw that scene.
It was beautiful.
Yeah. And for those that want the missing scene, if you read the IDW Back to the Future comic book series, it's in there. It's in issue number 4, I think it is.
Awesome.
Issue 3 or 4. It's called Jurassic Biff, where Biff accidentally goes back too far, and he ends up in the Jurassic period before he makes it to 1955.
I mean, it was, yeah, I loved it. And just him coming back the way that he does in the third act, I thought was just brilliant structuring. And, using the hoverboard between movie 2 and 3 was great. Was there something really important that you learned by the time 2 was done that led into 3? Again, the brilliance of 3 is that it really is now Doc's kind of story and his time to shine. He's the person that goes through the most change. It would have been actually a bad turn if it was a Marty love story. It was just so refreshing to see Doc's love story. It's funny, Marty never gets a love story. His parents do, Doc does. Marty just has a girlfriend that, he's, fine with before the movie even starts. So it was always interesting. Was there something that was really important that you learned on 2 that influenced what reshoots you were maybe doing on 3 and things for 3, or were they pretty much locked at that point?
Well, no, you see when we started, 2 and 3 was going to be one movie. It was a 4-act. We had a 4-act script, where the 4th act was 1885, and it didn't work as a 4-act, 160-page script. And after this draft, I said to Bob, "Look, this 4th act thing isn't working." I said, "I think I want to write this and give the characters the space they need to breathe, to be characters, to have all these great scenes that I feel as a writer are necessary." And he said, "Okay, go do it." And I forget whether it was over Thanksgiving or Christmas, sometime around that time. And I just powered through, and I came up with a 210-page script, and it bisected at exactly the place where the movies split. And I said, "Look, we've got enough material here to make 2 movies. Let's make 2 movies." And Bob thought that was a great idea, and the studio did not. They thought we had this conversation with Sid Sheinberg as CEO of MCA. We said, "Sid, we've got some good news, and we've got some bad news. The bad news is that Back to the Future Part 2 will not be the big summer release for 1989 that you were counting on. The good news is we will have it out for Thanksgiving of 1989. It'll play all the way through Christmas, and we will have Back to the Future Part 3 for the summer of 1990. And he thought we were completely out of our minds. He said, "I just want one movie. I just want Back to the Future Part 2. Would you just make Back to the Future Part 2? So we budgeted this massive script, and the budget came in at, I don't know, $55 million. It was ridiculously expensive. Now, when the budget came in and we realized how much it was going to cost, I gave the production manager the 210-page version. And I said, "I want you to budget this as if it was two movies. And here's where the part 2 ends, and here's where part 3 begins. Do 2 budgets for part 2 and part 3." And so then we give Universal this $55 million budget, and he was outraged. He said, "We're not going to make the most expensive movie ever made," which at $55 million it would have been. And then I said, "Sid, here's the alternative. Instead of doing one movie for $50 or $55 million, for $70 million, we'll give you 2 movies." Then, and I laid these budgets on him, and then the economics of it made sense. And he said, I get it. Okay, do it."
That's awesome. That's awesome. I mean, the end of the second movie with the letter is perfect. It's a great breaking off point. It's, everything about it works. And obviously I love the third movie too. I know we're starting to run out of time. What would you say was your biggest challenge on the third movie? Because I think if I was going to pick one sequence to talk about, and I really love the movie, the train sequence at the end was just fantastic. And I'm curious how difficult was.
The biggest challenge for making part 3 was that part 2 wasn't finished. We were shooting part 3 and editing part 2. And there was a 2-week period during the shooting of part 3 where we shot part 3 on location. I flew back to Los Angeles and I supervised the sound mix and dub on Back to the Future Part 2 during the day. Zemeckis would shoot, and he was shooting a train sequence during the daytime up in Northern California. He would get on a private plane. He would fly back when we lost the light up there. He'd come to Universal Studios. We'd have dinner waiting for him on the dubbing stage. we'd play back the reel that I mixed. He would make his notes. He would say, "Fix this, change that. I don't like that." We'd make all those adjustments. He'd go to the Sheraton Universal. He'd sleep. He'd get up at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, go to the Burbank Airport. There'd be a plane there, take him back up to
Wow.
Sonora, California, and we do it all over again over a 2-week period. That was the most challenging thing that we had to do during part 3.
That's awesome. You have this dissembling of the time machine. Doc starts talking in part 2 that he wants to just destroy it. It's causing too much havoc. In part 3, they do destroy it by accident. The modern train runs it over. And it's this interesting moment. I could have seen the movie ending there because now maybe the loop is closed. But of course, you guys have this other moment of brilliance where, this time train shows up with their kids, Jules and Vern, and showing that Doc is really living the good life. And
Exactly.
I'm curious at that moment, did you ever envision a Back to the Future 4? Because I know that you had the animated series, obviously, where you got into it. You've also delved into the narrative more in the comic books as well, and some of the video games too. But was there ever any plans for a Back to the Future?
No. At the end of part 3, it says "the end," something you rarely see at the end of any movie anymore. The end credits just start rolling, but we put "the end" because we really wanted to put a period on it. No, it's not. And for those of you that only saw the movie on VHS back in the day, where it says "to be continued," that was never said at the end of the first movie in the theater. And the starting with the DVD release in 2003, we took that off of there because we wanted the DVDs and every version of it to reflect the actual movie that ran in the theater. But we did put "to be concluded" at the end of part 2, and then we put "the end" to make sure everybody understood. Nope, we're not doing a part 4. We're not doing that. We have taken these characters exactly where we want to take them. Marty and Doc, basically, they dramatically change places. It's great and it's encapsulated in that movie where Marty says, "Great Scott," and Doc says, "I know this is heavy," and they have switched places. Where Marty is trying to tell Doc, "You're a scientist. You got to do what's right up here," and Doc is saying, "I got to do what's in my heart," and it is dramatically wonderful.
It's great that it has this ending. I love these 3 movies. With all the years that have passed and delving back into it, have you ever considered a different branch of Back to the Future movies with Jules and Vern rather than focusing on the Marty Doc storyline?
No, because if you're going to call something Back to the Future, that's a really high bar. And if we were going to write another time travel movie, we wouldn't start it about these 2 kids that live in the Old West. It's just not the right way to start a brand new original time travel movie. So all anybody would ever say is, it's not as good as the other Back to the Future movies. And why do we want to put ourselves? Why do we want to compare ourselves to ourselves like that? It's the best you can possibly do is break even. But history's told us that this is a bet that you lose. So that's why we've been steadfast in saying, nope, it's a trilogy. At the rate Hollywood is going with additional movies, it may end up being the only trilogy. But yeah, we're very satisfied with the 3 movies as they are. Are there nitpicks about them? Sure, of course there are. But by and large, let's leave the space-time continuum alone.
I'm curious. Other movies. Do you have any scripts sitting on the shelf that are like labors of love that you never got made that you want to tell us about, or something new coming out?
Oh my God, yes, I have. I have a lot of scripts that are various labors of love in various different genres, and we don't have time to go into all of them or any of them really. But yeah, I do. I'm in a business that's very difficult to be in these days, the original screenplay business, because studios don't want to make originals anymore. They just want to make sequels, spin-offs, stuff based on a novel, a graphic novel, a comic book, an old TV series, whatever. And so it's damn near impossible to get something original off the ground. So on that note, I would throw out a shout out to last year's movie Yesterday, which I thought was one of the most wonderful original movies. You have to be a Beatles fan to appreciate, which of course I am. I thought that was a fabulous movie, and the movie that won the Oscar, Parasite. It was just a wonderfully twisted, perverse, fascinating black comedy, and it could have only been made as an original movie because it was a Korean film. And again, my hat is off to the filmmaker of that because I just loved it.
Well, I hope we'll talk again and talk about some of your other scripts that I hope maybe one day might be worth dusting off, because a good script
They're all worth dusting off.
Exactly. That's my thoughts exactly. A good script is always a good script. You dusted off Back to the Future, as you told us, after Romancing the Stone was
well,
made,
we never put it in the drawer. It was
Sure.
just sort of on hiatus, if you will.
Do you have anything else coming out soon that you want to tell us about? Anything else that you've been
Back to the Future, Back to the Future, the musical.
Right. I was going to ask. How involved with that are you?
Oh, totally involved with it. I wrote the book, went to all the rehearsals, was involved in the casting, was involved in everything, the songwriting, worked very closely with the director, with the production team, with Dal Silvestri and Glenn Ballard,
That's great.
Composer and lyricist. It opened in Manchester in February. We had to close it 5 weeks later because of COVID.
Right.
And, knock on wood, that things return to a semblance of normalcy. We're planning to have it back up and running in London in the West End at the Adelphi Theatre in May 14th,
Great.
2021. Backtothefuturemusical.com for more information. And we have about 30 minutes on the new 4K Blu-ray DVD release dedicated to Back to the Future the musical.
That's great.
If you're a Back to the Future fan, you will love it. We had Back to the Future fans out the wazoo coming to see it from all over the world in Manchester. They loved it. And even for those people that maybe only saw the movies once or never, the musical works, even if you've never seen it. And we, believe it or not, have people in the theater that had never seen the movie. Couldn't believe it, but they hadn't, and they thoroughly enjoyed it. So I couldn't be more proud of how we were able to translate Back to the Future to the stage. You will absolutely believe that the DeLorean travels 88 miles an hour right there on the stage in front of you. It's some amazing theater craft.
I can't wait to see it. I before the pandemic, it was kind of on my list of how could I either get over there to see it or when the hell is it coming to America? So
we'll get it over here too.
Oh yeah,
I know.
Here
too. Yeah.
Well, look, I'm sorry we went a few minutes over time, but Bob, it was amazing talking to you. I'm a longtime fan of your work, and I can't wait to see what you do next. So thanks so much for your time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks. Pleasure being here. And pleasure that you did your homework. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's how the Q&A went down. Thanks again to Bob Gale for being so generous with his time and talking about writing Back to the Future 1, 2, and 3. And if you are a fan, and I'm sure you are, don't forget they also released an amazing 35th anniversary box set for Back to the Future 1, 2, and 3. And it's packed with bonus features. It looks amazing. It sounds amazing. So if you're a fan, there's no reason to even be on the fence about this one. This is definitely a must-have. And of course, if you're looking for other cool things to occupy your time with, I would love it if you stopped over to backstory.net and checked out Backstory Magazine. We're just about ready to publish issue 42, which is our long-delayed pandemic issue, and we could definitely use your support and would appreciate it as well. And as a show of our support, you could use coupon code SAVE5. That's the word SAVE, the number 5. That will save you $5 off a subscription to Backstory Magazine. You could read us on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app. Heck, you could even test drive us by going to backstory.net and reading the free issue, which you could also read in the Backstory app as well. And after reading the free issue, I think you'll see what we're all about, and we'd love to have you as a subscriber. Your subscription includes access to our archive, which currently goes back to around issue 30, and we're adding new, older issues to it. That's right, new, older issues. And we're going to keep going all the way back to number 1. And it also allows you to read whatever new content we generate within the year. And as I said, we're just about ready to release our our issue 42, our long delayed pandemic issue, and we're going to go right into a new issue right after that. So your support means everything to us, and I appreciate you considering giving my passion project a look. The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith podcast is a copyright of Unlikely Films Incorporated in 2020. All rights reserved. If you're looking to reach me on social media, you could check out Yo Goldsmith on Twitter or Instagram. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, the publisher of Backstory and the host of the Q&A, thanking you for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.